Yeah, all good. Fire away.
The jurisdictions in English law start in equity. Because of the land tenure, every all English colonies are bound by the common law. So everybody that uses English law is bound by the English law land tenure. The equitable jurisdiction within it, that are the governments, all create their own individual laws within that incorporeal hereditament for their own members of that jurisdiction. Right? So remember, these are all jurisdictions wrapped into jurisdictions wrapped into jurisdictions. So to understand what they're doing in this equity jurisdiction, gone to C, and page 1 on the jurisdictions PDF, they use private international law. Private international law is basically also law of nations, but private international law deals with the conflicts in law, and that deals with the conflicts between the succession and those in fee simple, and how all these jurisdictions apply inside the fee simple. So private international law is the area of law that we start to gather the required law to force those in equity to abide by the common law that is also represented in the law of equity. Because everything that is being shown in the common law, it's also mirrored as in what's called a reversionary right in all the provincial and federal laws of each corporation. Law of property, landlord and tenant, law of conveyance, ownership act, and a bunch of others. We'll be posting them, starting to post them soon. A bunch are already in the blog on Omnipotence. So private international law starts off where it goes left to the sui juris, and it stops right there. Means you're a true owner of land. Sui juris is not a monarchy. You're not a sovereign. Sovereigns are only those that are acting in trust for another. You can't be a sovereign because then you'd be the monarchy. English law created the word sovereign and the jurisdiction of the sovereign, so you cannot recreate it or claim it because it's not your jurisdiction. The only jurisdiction we have as natural individuals is the sui juris, and it has nothing to do with anything on the right side of the page. Everybody on the right side of your page is the guardians to the lands and to the sui juris on the left. That's also in the Magna Carta and many, many others. Magna Carta 1225, Chapter 4, to be precise. So it goes private international law, which is English law and equity. So it's the common law and equity. The common law is represented by the monarchy and the English common law. The equity is represented by what, right? The monarchy law and the English common law is the corporeal jurisdiction. Everything in orange is the incorporeal jurisdiction created from that original land grant between the sui juris and the monarchy, right? So as soon as the sui juris grants the trust to the monarchy, now they become a trust. Now the sui juris becomes the citizen because they have, right? Because that's a part of the contract and acceptance. Because a contract doesn't always have the actual contract itself doesn't need acceptance if the contract is stating that somebody has to perform a bunch of things in order to give that contract acceptance. If we looked at English law, that's exactly what English law is stating. English law is the contract. All English law is the contract to these different levels of trusts. It's your actions that are fulfilling that contract, because nobody has ever signed an act of law in English law, ever. No one in fee simple signs any law. They sign deed pools. So English law created what is called equity. And private international law created the law of nations. Everybody within the law of nations is in English common law. It's a English colony. They created the United Nations for all those different jurisdictions that the monarchy allowed to create through the trading companies transporting the English law around the world. So that's why the United Nations was created. And you'll notice that the law of nations didn't happen until after the 1600s. Same with the United Nations. All these things did not happen until after the 1600s. So we can see that law of nations binds all the jurisdictions within the common law jurisdiction that's working in the incorporeal jurisdiction. Then they made because there was so many of them, all those groups got together and made another group, made another jurisdiction, because the monarchy gave them this incorporeal jurisdiction the right to create laws and to make new groups and so on and so forth. We could probably stick in the EU now in there, right? So as you can see, they're allowed to keep creating more fiction inside fiction and trusts inside trusts. So inside every government, there's 3 levels. There's the federal, there's provincial, and then there's the municipal. This, because it's already created, the power goes down. When it originally was created, the individual grants to B, right? And B creates C, and A volunteers to B's system, right? Which is municipal law, to give it acceptance. So if there was no one in the system at all yet, and let's say it was just starting, the very first person that comes in, because it's only one person, they're not a group yet. So municipal law can't even be created yet. It's that second person that gets together and they create that municipal corporation within that territory, creates municipal law. Once you have enough municipal law jurisdictions, you get a provincial jurisdiction. Once you have enough provincial jurisdictions built up, you get a federal jurisdiction. Once you got enough federal jurisdictions, right, you get your United Nations jurisdiction, right? See what I'm getting at? And same with the law of nations, right? Because law of nations and United Nations are basically the same thing, but the law of nations was never really actually recognized in the court of law, where now the equity is, right, because law of nations was originated from private international law, which is common law, so it can't be recognized anymore. So the equity had to write their own laws for their own jurisdiction to recognize them and to have the force and effect of equity's presumption and not the common law's presumption of who the true owner is. So that's why they created the law of the United Nations, was so they could add that assumption into this next level. So as we look into the page 2, private international law, it's a specialized branch of law which resolves cases which have an element of conflicting foreign law. Some jurists prefer to call this subject matter of law conflicts of law. And you'll notice that it's strange that when we're dealing with law of domicile, especially private international law and conflict of laws, subject matter is now the key word used to describe everything that's being done in this jurisdiction. So this is mirrored in the equity jurisdiction, because the subject matter, when people are refuting personal jurisdiction and subject matter jurisdiction, they're refuting the corporate person and the subject matter of that law, of that civil law, right? So people that are actually challenging their reversionary right and challenging that equitable jurisdiction, by them not defining that, they're actually challenging the true subject matter, which is the territorial jurisdiction, and their right as the assumed owner, is where a lot of people are going wrong, right? Because The true subject matter is the land tenure that was granted to give these guys the jurisdiction to create the law, right, that you accepted, right? So that's why there's two subject matters, right? But there's only one personal jurisdiction, right? So the subject matter depends on what your jurisdiction is in. If they're assuming that you're the fee simple, they're assuming that the subject matter is the civil law, right? So when you're in common law and you're doing your reversionary right for your land tenure, right? The subject matter is the land tenure. See what I'm getting at? So I wanted to, that's very important to point out when you're reading private international law, that they're actually talking about subject matter and succession. Private international law, conflict of laws, I believe it's in the second chapter, specifically tells you that the succession is yours, right? If you realize that the writing. Can everybody still hear me?
Yeah, still can hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
Everybody should be on mute, I guess. That's probably why I don't hear a lot of people saying, "Yeah, we can hear you."
Yeah. I had to quickly come back and turn mine on. Yeah, go ahead, mate. It's cool.
And because of these because of the subject matter, the true subject matter being the territory, and the assumed owner of those lands being the trustee, writes the laws. That's where the conflict of law comes in, especially to resolve disputes where some elements of the case commands that referral, right? The law, the rule of law governing that analysis are known as private international law, right? So it's taking us more into a defining what these jurisdictions are within the English law jurisdiction. It'll also explain to you why the citizens don't have the rights to use the United Nations law in the court, right, and so on and so forth. It goes through all those things because it's every capacity only has its own laws of its own jurisdiction to use, right? If you're not privy to that agreement, then you can't use that law unless that group enacts it into law. Sui juris is basically means of one's own right. I've moved on to page 3. In civil law, it means legal competence, right? So you have the capacity to manage your own affairs. So we can see that sui juris, even in equity, because civil law is equity, it's not the true definition of common law. So as you can see that these definitions are changing for what capacity and what law you're in. Page 3 goes into the common law. For a really good book on the common law and it being the original grant, it's the second book and second top download on omnipotence, treatise on land tenures. It explains all this. It's the footnote from Blackstone that takes you to the entire history of the English law of the land tenures and for all the different jurisdictions. It's an amazing read. So common law is basically the law that judges wrote on the bench in common law. And we'll notice that right away there's well, how can that even be? Because in equity, judges can't write law. They have to send it back to Parliament to be fixed, right? They can only find a law of no force or effect. So what's happening here, right? Because we can already see that there's a huge difference between what these different systems can do and what they can't do. And it's done because, how to explain this? The monarchy had to appoint judges to handle the things for that monarchy, because obviously being one person with all the people in their realms, the monarchy could never be a judge to these things for all the issues and everything going on. So that's why she created this corporation, so that they could manage these things within themselves. But yet that system had to have something else to base all that on, and that's all the common law, before she granted all the use completely away by 1932. Because it actually took till 1932 in the Statute of Westminster for the monarchy to give all the rights to the governments to create and a judge and do all their own things within their own jurisdiction. And that's why it took till 1985 for these corporations to make an actual constitution. So we can see, not since a certain time in law, which I believe is up to 1925, is where these judges, that even when they were in equity, if there was no equity law at that time written, the judge would create a law, or it would fall back onto a common law. So if there was no law of equity, because that jurisdiction didn't create it yet, it fell back onto common law. If there was no law in common law, the judges had to create it, right? Because the monarchy gave the authority to the judge to create things for the best of the realms, right? So it was our luck that the monarchy actually appointed some really good judges over time, right? Which would be Littleton and Coke. Mansfield would be another one. There's many good common law judges that, if the monarchy wouldn't have put these judges in there, we wouldn't have a law to restrict them. We would have to be creating a law to restrict them and fighting for that right to create the law to restrict them, right? So as we can see, that the common law is very important, and the understanding on what that is, because that also means that if you were to bring something into court today in a common law capacity as a reversion, and if equity didn't have a law written, it would fall back to common law. And then if common law didn't, and if the common law remedies did not apply to the situation at hand, the judge has to create one right there on the spot. So I don't really think we need to get into a lot of the reading on this, because I pretty much done it all by that very first two slides. Everybody else can kind of like read through everything else. Everything on here is on omnipotence, like it goes through the UN Charter. That's also on omnipotence, or you can go to the UN website and get it right from there. I don't have links in this PDF because it was actually a slideshow that I just made into a PDF. But I would like to drop to page 6 because there's another picture that basically really that helps show the true original start of it, right? Where you are a sui juris, where you actually split into two things here, right? Because there's two trusts, there's two indentures, right? And there's two different agreements. So you have the agreement to the monarchy that creates a land tenure, which creates all these things over on the right side for that equitable person to do. But yet you have to join equity as the equitable person, and then a bunch of you have to get together and then then you guys have to decide to create a municipal jurisdiction out of your own ignorance, right? And same with growing enough to be a province, and then federal, and right. So this is reversing it so you can see how it actually what. So it's I think that's a really good visual on how it was created and how you change your capacities as well, right? Because you're only an individual as sui juris. As soon as you start getting to the incorporeal side or the side of equity, you now have joined the group. And that's why now you have a hard hat and a hammer, because now you're a part of a corporation as a corporate person. You are no longer yourself in sui juris. The group's agreements and the original laws that the group has apply, because you came in after they're already right, because we're in the year 2018, and well, these things were created a long time ago. See what I'm getting at? So that's why it's the same as even joining Costco. When you join, you're agreeing to all the rules of that group. If you don't agree to all those rules of that group, either you get all those rules changed before you join, or you don't join the group. Because by joining the group, you've now made yourself lower than the people that you want to get to change those rules, so you actually want to be a part of that group, right? They're making a proclamation, a constitution, because nobody's elected them. You're volunteering to them, right? So the only way that you can stop somebody from trying to charge you $500 for an apple is don't buy that apple from them. But what people do is like, yeah, okay, right? And then they join the group, and then now the apple's $1,000, right? It's going the opposite way to get remedy, right? Because the levels of trust and how they're made. Because everybody in fee simple think that they're the owner of things. They think that they created the government, when no, they're actually the government. All fee simple are the government. They just took on an extra role. So everybody within fee simple are the same unlawful individuals that have made it legal for the group. So that's basically that. Does anybody have any questions or anything on that?
Oh, gold.
Okay. Now I guess